Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, currently in that place between heaven and hell, Brooklyn, New York. And if I'm going to be boning up on my bird mythology, I'd better not be doing it alone. And so luckily, I'm not here alone. I've got someone who's taking this trip with me. Who is that across the way?
Well, it's me, Steve Guntley, and I hate being a mean bastard. But, sometimes you got to do it. Sometimes you just got to do it. This is the podcast about spooky brothels, killer flying hands, and, of course, man birds. That's because this is a podcast about Netherworld, the Southern fried supernatural thriller from the director of Puppet Master, who also, we have somebody else descending into the Netherworld with us today. Jared, who's joining us today?
We are indeed dragging someone down with us into the Netherworld today. The person in question is a festival award-winning horror screenwriter, has reviewed for Gruesome Magazine and Horror News Radio. Really cool credit here. The head of the screenplay competition at the New York City Horror Film Festival for, I think, going on about 8 years now, and also a programmer at that festival. But beyond all of these amazing credits, just a cool dude and a pretty amazing horror trivia rival to myself. I'm talking, of course, Brian W. Smith. Brian, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Never. Yes. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I've been with New York City Horror for about 8 years, but the festival itself has been around for like over 20. So, it's been fun to be a part of it, and it's coming up in a couple of weeks. So, this is a nice little diversion from all that festival prep to be able to watch a movie that's not a festival submission, and get back into the real world.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because I follow you on all your social medias and stuff, and I see you constantly posting festival related things, and I'm like, it's just that fest life. You're living that fest life all the time. And so now you got to just sit back and kick your heels up a little bit and watch a full moon movie and come on our show and talk about it. So Brian, you've been working with the New York City Horror Film Festival for a while now. I know you're a horror lover, incredibly well-versed in it. You know a ton of stuff. Was this something that started for you as a kid? Like, were you a video store kid like Steve and myself? Did it begin there? And like, how did you make the jump then from like, oh, I like horror to I'm going to consume anything and everything, including all the low budget indie stuff around me?
Yeah, I was in that sweet spot of being like sort of an 80s kid. And I think when people ask like when did it start, I think I was a scaredy cat when I was a kid, of course, and I was shielded and protected away from a lot of 80s horror from my family, my sisters. Everybody was like very protective of me as a kid. But like, you couldn't, in that era, you couldn't get away from it. Like it found a way to sneak in, whether it was in the newspaper, like the ad for like scanners, anything that was horror related found its way to children. It really did. I don't know who was behind it.
And you couldn't even listen to music without all the satanic messages.
No, it's true. Because I exclusively listen to them backwards too. So yeah.
I mean, yeah, that was in the culture, but I think it was around like it was very early for me. It was like Michael Jackson's Thriller, and then you have like the Making of Thriller, and then that sort of spawned my love of like just understanding how movies were made, how horror films were made, especially like you get to know all the special effects artists by name, and they feel like we're friends. I got into Fangoria in '88. That was my first issue. Was the Phantasm 2 cover when
nice.
It was just like. And '88 was a great year too. It was like that was the issue with like Child's Play in it, and I think The Blob was out that year, and Halloween 4. Yeah. So that was I was 11, so that's when it pretty much started. And
Brian, I think you and I spoke about this actually in a conversation that we had, because I think '88 was my first Fangoria also. I'm a couple of years younger than you, but like I think '88 was my first Fangoria, and I think it was the one with the cover for Nightmare 4.
Okay, yeah.
But that's that's a good year. Yeah. Now you name some of them. I'm like, that's a pretty good year.
Yeah. They Live is out that year. Yeah. Lots of good stuff. Yeah. So when did you first come to this movie that we're talking about today, Netherworld? Is this one you've seen before, or did you kind of jump in blind like we did?
Oh no, I'm not as versed in Full Moon as many people as this gentleman right here, as you guys. Yeah, I remember the cover art, the box art. Like,
Yeah.
there was a time where like you could just look at the box art of a VHS on a shelf and feel like you saw the whole movie. Like, you don't necessarily need to watch it. And that was the case with a lot of full moon films. They just all pretty much escaped me. I never really watched them on cable and things. So this was probably my first all the way through full moon movie. I know I've seen pieces of like Puppet Master and things like that, but I think this is my first real deep dive into a full moon film.
Amazing. Well, what made you want to choose this one in particular? It was just the box art stuck in your head?
I remember the box art when especially when I saw the hand jumping out, and I was like, oh, okay, that sometimes the box art sold the movie more so than the actual movie, but yeah, I just remember that, and when I was invited to be a part of the show, I was just like, yeah, I want to check this one out. I just remember that from my youth.
Well, we appreciate people who are willing to just kind of like jump in on some of these random movies. A lot of like the big seminal movies are taken, but sometimes you find the most fun like discovering something or really kind of digging into the archives a little bit. So we appreciate you taking the chance on this
and
one.
Brian, I would have never guessed that this was. I would have guessed maybe this was a first time watch of this movie, but I would have never thought that you would be so green when it came to full moon movies. I mean, Steve and I, as we go through the show, we realize like there's a handful that I've seen, and I've seen more than Steve, but I'm not somebody who has seen them all by any measurable metric. I have not seen even close to all of them, but there are a handful of them that I did watch multiple times. I don't necessarily want to say growing up because I was late to it as well, but in my most kind of formative years when I became kind of an analyzer of films, I found a couple of them, your Dollmans and Head of the Family and stuff like that. And they became very endearing to me, and your Puppet Master and a couple of the Puppet Master sequels. But yeah, I love the fact that this was your like first one, because I feel like you can have a conversation about Full Moon with somebody and you have a completely different entry point for 99.9% of people to the company. So I'm glad that your first full moon experience is with us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I've got a couple of stats to rattle off about this here movie. Let's get into it a little bit. So Netherworld was released February 6, 1992. It's directed and written by David Schmoller, here writing under the pseudonym Billy Chicago. Great pseudonym there, yeah.
Jackie Daytona.
I had a feeling that was a fake name.
Yeah, he's Billy Chicago, human bartender, yeah.
Regular human screenwriter.
This stars Michael Bendetti, Denise Gentile, Holly Floria, Robert Sampson, Holly Butler, Alex Datcher, and David Schmoller as Billy Chicago, the great bottle spinning bartender. First of all, I need to start by saying there's an IMDb trivia fact that says that David Schmoller just had the ability to spin a bottle on his finger like this. I'm calling bullshit on that. I know IMDb trivia is a bastion for truth and honesty, but you could see it's attached to a pin. You can see it in the movie. It's attached to a little mechanism on his finger. This is not a trick he does. But David
the Full
Schmoller
Moon
has
Video Zone would say otherwise.
Oh yes,
because
yes,
there is a segment of him where he is talking, and the entire time he's talking, the bottle is spinning on his finger, and it's the same trick, but it's pretty amusing.
It's pretty funny. So David Schmoller, obviously we know him as a longtime Full Moon and Charles Band director. He worked on Tourist Trap, which is kind of the first big breakout movie. He worked on Crawl Space with Klaus Kinski, which I cannot wait to talk about.
Oh my God,
and of course, most significantly, he was the director and writer of the first Puppet Master movie, the Full Moon's most enduring and beloved series to this day. And I think things have started getting, I'm only speculating here. I'm just kind of reading between the lines a little bit. I feel like things were getting a little tense between David Schmoller and Charles Band, because this is going to be the last project they work on together. And Schmoller was trying to pitch Charles Band on an erotic thriller that he was working on with David Duchovny that was called Whispers and Shadows, which was like a voyeuristic, like sexy thriller. But according to Schmoller, Band wasn't really interested in anything that wasn't sci-fi, horror, or fantasy, because those are the things he knew, and those are the things he knew he could sell. You know, the erotic thriller thing was really popping off around this time in mainstream cinemas. But
we are in the heyday of the erotic thriller. 1992, like this, these were adult, well, no, not adult movies by definition, but movies aimed for adults. that I
Netherworld would
remember.
have,
Like,
yeah,
oh, go ahead,
Netherworld would
Steve.
have hit the video stores the same month as Basic Instinct hitting theaters. So like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's right there. It's right on the cusp of like blowing up.
Oh,
It
yeah.
probably would have been a more enduring or more of a media play if they had actually made the erotic thriller rather than just another kind of supernatural thriller. But either way, the project, they got far enough to work on like a poster and a screenplay. Like they had the elements in place, but band wasn't really interested, and so instead they abandoned the project, and he gave Schmoller this project, which Ted Nicolau had been offered previously and turned down to work on more subspecies movies. So Charles Band wanted this project to be a voodoo-centered horror film set in New Orleans, but Schmoller felt that the voodoo thing was kind of played out, and he wanted to add his own little spin to it. And so he settled on bird people. Bird people instead of
It's a
straight
natural
voodoo.
progression.
Natural progression makes total sense. We'll go into the bird peopleness of all of this as we go. But yeah, I am a little curious if Schmoller is bitter about how this project turned out, because this movie essentially was the end of his career, you know, in a significant way. He would direct a couple of like smaller films, a few shorts, you know, a couple of tiny things that he basically self-financed, but he never really got another full moon movie, and he never got another kind of mainstream hit. I don't think he's made a full-length movie since 2012 at this point. Not to say he's not doing fine. I found out that he has had great success in academia. He was a visiting fellow at the UT Austin Film Program, which is now where I work. Woohoo! And he is currently a professor at the University of Las Vegas. So, like, he's doing okay. He's doing fine. But this was essentially the end of his filmmaking career. Um, the other noteworthy thing to mention about Netherworld is the soundtrack. This
Mhm.
was kind of the beginning of a very forgotten chapter of the Full Moon lore that we have not touched on at all because I was not aware of it until today.
Really?
Moonstone Records. I did not know that Full Moon had their own short-lived record label that they used to release their soundtracks on. Now, this was kind of the one that they were really trying to springboard it a little bit, because they have some actual mainstream musical talent here. The score is composed by David Bryan from the band Bon Jovi. And we have a very jarring and strange appearance by 70s rock legend Edgar Winter, who shows up here playing sexy saxophone in all his albino glory and the bar scene. I was watching it and I'm like, oh, that guy's kind of got an Edgar Winter thing going on. It didn't occur to me that, like, oh, that's actually Edgar Winter. Like, all right, that's cool. But yeah, Moonstone Records would release a handful of soundtracks for the movies. I think they ended after Shrunken Heads, the great Richard Elfman movie. But they also had a couple of, like, they were Quiet Riot's label in the early 90s. Like, Quiet Riot shifted over to them. Like, so they didn't have any affiliation with any of the movies, but they were, you know, on Moonstone.
This is a
Uh,
really interesting piece of Full Moon's history that I want to talk about, because you're right, it is often overlooked, but they go out of their way in the video zone to talk about it. And it's like they did get some mainstream talent, like you said, and you know, I mean, Edgar Winter is there with a saxophone, so Tim Capello, move over. You've got some company
there
in
you
the
go.
sexy sax department. But you've also, yeah, David Bryan. Now, say what you want about Bon Jovi. I'm not the world's biggest fan or anything like that, but I think I watched his segment of the Video Zone, and he talked about getting on board for this. And basically, they're like, "We're making this movie in New Orleans. We need a soundtrack or a score plus a soundtrack song that we think fits the mood of the movie." And he came up with what he called the Netherworld Waltz, which I think plays a few times in the movie, and then, you know, composed little bits and bobs here and there that comprised some of the incidental score. And I think he did a really good job. If
I
I'm
think
being
so.
honest, I think there are definitely things you can nitpick about this movie, but I think that
One or
this is
two.
a weird relationship that kind of worked. And I think what he produced for the movie totally fits with the tone and the mood of the movie. Well, I have no issues with the score or the soundtrack, and
No.
we'll talk more about Moonstone Records in a few weeks when we drop our episode on bad channels, where we get Blue Oyster Cult performing some original songs and score.
That's
that
right.
movie, and then we'll also Spellcaster in the near future,
Adamant, yeah.
Adamant and Richard Blade, so I think
There are a couple of noteworthy titles that were released on this record label. It's even hard to Google. Like you have to modify because there's like 10 dozen like Moonstone record labels now, and they're mostly like SoundCloud rappers. But like there are a lot of different Moonstone records on the internet, but not the one related to Full Moon. You have to modify your search quite a bit to find it. But like I said, I think this movie succeeds in some atmosphere. I think it helps that they chose, like, originally they were just going to shoot this in Romania. They have the interiors that were done in Romania at their studio there, but Charlie Band did actually spring for some location shooting in New Orleans, which I think was essential. If you're going to have a movie set in New Orleans, you do need to have a little bit of that flavor, and Romania is not quite the same thing. So I appreciate that they got that. Like, they got the sweatiness, they got apparently it's a hard and fast rule that any movie set in New Orleans, the main character needs to be wearing like a shabby white shirt with a tie, and he looks uncomfortable and is fanning himself all the time. Because I feel like that's just shorthand for New Orleans, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So like, this movie, yeah, it's got some flaws, and I'm gonna be honest. There was a significant chunk of the final third where I was watching it. I was not taking notes. I was not doing anything else, looking at my phone, anything else, but it still just kind of slid over my brain. Like I was looking at it and not processing anything. And so the movie felt a lot shorter to me because I'm just like, oh, wait, we're at the climax all of a sudden. Wait, what just happened in those last 30 minutes? Like I totally zoned out. So if I missed anything really essential, I'm hoping you guys can fill me in on some of the gaps. But, I appreciated I appreciate how much of a zag this is, because I agree with David Schmuller. I don't need to see another like hackneyed voodoo movie. Like it's always a little culturally insensitive and gross, and all of these tropes have kind of been beaten to death. So I appreciate that they found something different. The problem for me, and I don't know if you guys will disagree, birds are not scary. All right, there's no part of a bird that's scary. Look, I know Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds is a classic of horror, but that movie is scary because of the unexplained nature of these attacks. It's just like that movie's not scary because it's birds attacking. It's because there's no reason for these things to be organizing and attacking. Like that's the reason that's scary. Birds themselves do not inherently hold any kind of menace, the same way like a bat would or something like that. It doesn't hold any kind of inherent danger to it. They're very small, they're very pretty, they're very frail.
Certainly true in the final shot.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, you don't think that was a scary bird in the final shot?
That was hilarious. That was I don't think it was meant to be hilarious, but
But in true Full Moon fashion, like you start with the box art, and the box art was this big scary looking hand coming out of the door. And a lot of the time you don't expect that to actually make it into the movie. You think like this is just a stylistic element that's meant to be kind of expressionistic of some of the content that's going to be in this movie. Like it's an evil, unseen force reaching through this door. But no, that hand is very much a character. That hand is in this movie. He flies around. And it's kind of my favorite thing about this movie because the hand is really weird. They call it the Hand of Satan. It's a rubber mold that the special effects artist took from another actor on another film, a very large man. So it's this big, big glove, and it flies around independently, kind of like the orb in Phantasm.
I was just gonna say that the shots of the hand flying, it's like this is directly taken from the mausoleum shots of the orbs in Phantasm.
Very much so. And it's also, all the fingers are snakes, but also birds, and also tentacles. Like, so there's a lot going on with this hand. Like sometimes like a finger will like have a snake mouth and it'll like screech, but it'll make a bird noise. Like it's a very confused hand. I don't know what's going on with it, but the hand is kind of the standout part of this movie, I think.
Well, this movie is kind of like a movie meatloaf. There are a lot of elements that are being baked together here. It's like, okay, the makers of this movie saw Angel Heart. The makers of this movie saw Phantasm. The makers of this movie saw a Foghorn Leghorn cartoon. Like
I'll
the
say,
main,
I'll say that hand of the devil
yeah.
is coming for
Although
you.
I will say, big missed opportunity here. Our main character, who we haven't talked a lot about yet, comes into the movie about 10 minutes in, not on an airboat, just on a regular motorboat. I'm like, you really want to set the tone for Louisiana here? Like, I need a swamp airboat bringing this guy in. But we do get some nice, like, I can't believe I'm still in Saigon voiceover, which
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can appreciate as well. But the thing about
Have
this,
y'all been to New Orleans in real life?
never have.
No, no.
Really cool. It's one of my favorite little cities. I want to go back. I haven't
Yeah.
been in a while, but it's such a great place to shoot a horror movie. And I'm surprised like every horror movie doesn't just default to New Orleans, because we talked a little bit about Bucharest in an episode that you're going to be hearing later. Our recording schedule is all messed up, but we were talking about Bucharest and how it has that kind of combination of old world ruin with like the new modernity sort of creeping in. And Louisiana or New Orleans has that. Like New Orleans
Yeah.
is kind of the most European feeling city in America. And it feels very haunted. It feels very tragic, but it's also unbelievably lively and joyous and fun. So definitely go to New Orleans if you get a chance.
So I have a question for Brian, which is, like, I'm describing this movie as a sum of a lot of parts, and obviously I think these people also were influenced by Twin Peaks.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
and this movie, to me, maybe I'm crazy, I like this movie. Like, I don't think it totally works as a movie, like a narrative, but it's got such weird, memorable imagery, and it flows kind of like a stream of consciousness. And to me, I enjoyed that aspect of it. I was watching it like, oh, there's a bar where there's snakes on the floor and chickens. I was like, it's very Santa Sangre for a minute. And then
Yeah.
there was this little kind of like cool jazz score in the background, and it was really just dreamlike and surreal. And then there were moments when it was kind of like phantasm. And then there was stuff going on where I was like really digging the aesthetic of what I was seeing. But then I thought about it and I was like, it's not really much of a movie in terms of linear storyline. So I would like to get a screenwriter's perspective on how this struck you as like a script, because I feel like there's so much stuff that kind of happens that seems almost inconsequential of any attempt at like real plot or narrative, which didn't really bother me, but it is sort of like messy in
Yeah.
terms of like how it's written. So I just want to get your perspective on like how this movie's written from a screenplay point of view.
Well, it's interesting you say stream of consciousness because that's exactly what I wrote in my notes. Stream of consciousness narrative. One of my early questions was narration, like it with a question mark. It came out of nowhere. Yeah, I agree with the sort of angel heart, phantasm. Even what we were talking about erotic thrillers, like I mean, 9.5 Weeks was like 86, Fatal Attraction 87, Angel Heart 87, Serpent in the Rainbow was 88. So I'll talk about like what I got out of the narrative. I just watched it a second time earlier before this, and what I got from the narrative was that it's doing that sort of Southern Gothic voodoo noir. It's pretty much if you want to describe it that way. It's an interesting take on that genre, particularly with noir, because you have this protagonist who's sort of thrust into this situation that's it's about his past, it's about his father. But normally in a noir, you would have the main character sort of debunking and disproving like the supernatural or whatever's going on, whatever's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, it seems like there's a hint of a really interesting story about this character, learning about his past, learning about this magic, and sort of being able to use it to his advantage later on. I think maybe if there was more of a hero's journey in terms of him learning more, trial and error throughout the process, it might work a little bit better. I don't know if it's just I'm personally on like a new age kick, so it kind of hit me in the sweet spot. But I like the fact that he was just so you don't very rarely see like a male protagonist sort of open to the sort of spirituality and that sort of thing. So there was something there that they could have worked on. My only issue was really the narrative, the pacing of it was very slow, and I can appreciate if there's budget limitations, things like that. I understand they got a lot of out of their location and the style and the setting. I don't know if it's a 90s thing. I mean, even the opening credits were kind of slow, but it
Yeah.
just has a pacing. It's like a glacial pace. And so just overall narratively, I'd say if it just picked up the pace a little bit more, added a little more suspense. It's not necessarily concerned with being scary or suspenseful. The two scenes with the hands were like the most horrific moments, that worked.
Yeah.
But I can see what it was trying to go for. It was gay, but even the love scene was kind of meh. I wrote that was the love scene. That was my note.
That was it. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I know
Love question mark?
it was going there, but then it didn't quite go there. It definitely didn't go there as far as like Angel Heart or any of the Adrian Lyne
Of course,
films.
yeah.
No.
So I was like, that's kind of all you have going for it. You have the, camera friendly cast, but they're not really given much to do. That's really intriguing. So that was just my overall feel of it.
Well,
But
you were not taken in by the smoldering charisma of 21 Jump Street's Michael Bendetti.
I didn't realize he was in that. I thought maybe he was in for like an episode or two. I didn't know he was part of the cast. So I was like, that's a shock.
They definitely Full Moon calls a lot of like soap opera actors to be their leads, and oftentimes like this is their one movie that they did. I think that's kind of the case with this guy.
The only one I recognized really was Alex Statcher who played Mary Magdalene. She was in Passenger 57. She was like the love interest or the flight attendant.
Oh, was she?
Yeah. And
I remember
but
her.
It's interesting that
She
a lot
was
of
in
the
the
cast
cast
hadn't
of,
really
like-
gone on to do anything.
Yeah, she was in the cast of like this really short-lived like Sherman Hemsley vehicle in the early 90s that I vaguely remember. I think I watched it. I forget what it's called now, but she was like the daughter in that. I thought she was
really?
good. Yeah.
Yeah, she was pretty good. I mean, she was doing that, the Southern drawl thing. So I feel like a lot of the pacing of the movie is the Southern drawl because it's like you're waiting for them to get the lines out.
Well, this
I
movie
mean-
is kind of a bunch of people sitting around complaining that they have the vapors.
It really is.
Right.
I think you're dead on with the pacing too, and it's kind of a bummer because I think this movie hits the ground running in such a fun way. Like my first note is like, okay, this movie opens on a bar populated entirely by chickens and stuntmen.
Right.
Like they're having an old school like Hal Needham style fight where they like jump through a bunch of boxes and land in gator water. It's like I'm like, all right, I'm in. And then it's like, oh, okay, and this is a brothel. Oh, okay, and then it's a demonic brothel. Okay, and this guy's getting turned into a Birdman.
Well,
in the
there's
background.
one scene, there's one like shot, one really short shot or scene in the opening bar scene of the movie that could have been a cut scene from Hard Target.
Yeah, absolutely. Or like
Yeah.
Roadhouse or something. Like it's got that kind of vibe to it. And then like even introducing the characters, I was still kind of on board with it because I'm like, these are such Southern Gothic ridiculous tropes. Like all of these characters are so stereotypical. You have like the old genteel. Yeah, you have like the old genteel lawyer, and then you have like the haunted old housekeeper, and then you have the sexpot daughter, and like all these different like really broad Southern melodrama caricatures that are like
Beauregard Yates Esquire. That is
Beauregard.
one of my favorite character names, and
I love that as a
Bijou.
shorthand. Again, like if you need
Yes.
if you need a Cajun character, we're naming him Beauregard. Like that's it. That's the only time you can use that name.
And Bijou, the performance of Bijou is a pretty fun one too. The actor's name is George Kelly, and he is chewing the scenery. He's having a good time.
He's a local.
I laughed so hard when the young guy comes up to fight him and he just punches him in the face and knocks him down, but without even turning around.
Yeah,
like it was very funny, and I always try to applaud what I feel to be committed performances and people in these B movies who are at least trying to match the energy of the material, and I think that's a fun performance. I was smiling when that guy was on screen.
Oh, I wrote choices were made.
They were
sure
were.
definitely made.
I want to dance with the boy.
It's just this movie starts so strong and starts so weird, and I was hoping it was going to maintain some of that momentum, but then we're retreading some Puppet Master territory with his dad, where he's trying to reanimate himself, and that's sort of like that's basically like the main plot of the movie, but it's sidelined for so much. So like I said, after I had my little glassy-eyed period towards the end of the movie, like they brought him back. I'm like, oh yeah, the dad is trying to resurrect himself, and that's the whole thrust of this movie. I lost sight of that completely. And also, like, I feel like the movie hamstrings itself by again, not to pick on actors, but Michael Benedetti, a little stiff, a little unlikable, and the love triangle that he's involved in is between a witch lady who turns people into birds and an underage girl. Like, that's the love triangle we're supposed to be invested
Right.
in here.
She is referred to as jailbait. So by the end, and I wrote in my notes, so love saves him. You know, it was just like I was like, where did that even come from? You know.
Somehow
Yeah.
less problematic than Meridian.
Yeah, somehow. Yeah, he gets away with the witch, but he has to spend the rest of his life introducing himself to his neighbors. You know, it's that kind of situation. Yeah, it's that's hard to get invested when those are your stakes, you know, when those are your romantic characters.
Right.
You know, we get some juice like in little bits and pieces where they go back to Tonks, the honky tonk brothel bar that has the portal to the Netherworld in it, because you get little moments like that. Like there's the muscly thug who's shaking people down, and then the hand flies out of nowhere and rips his face open, and probably the best like special effects kill scene of the movie.
Yeah.
That looked pretty good, and that was pretty fun.
Yeah, big ups to Mark Schustrom. He's
Yeah.
great. We've covered a bunch of stuff that he's worked on. He did a lot of Elm Street stuff, heavily involved in like Dream Warriors, and maybe part 4 too. But yeah, no, he's great. He always does good work, and I think the scene they're showing how the scene with the hand had like sort of the strings that then came out and took over, obviously shot backwards, but looks really
Right.
good. And there's a kind of a hilarious cut where it goes from like, okay, the hand is on his face and the strings are now engulfing him. It cuts to something else. It cuts back to him and he is covered in blood.
Oh yeah.
which I appreciated, because I always like when we talked about, you know, we've had the pleasure, like Steve mentioned, our recording schedule has been a little switched around, but we've had the pleasure over the last couple of weeks to talk about a couple of what we feel are like really legit full moon movies where you see all of the budget on screen. Like we talked about Subspecies 2, and we talked about Arena, which we felt like you can see these are low budgets, but everything's put on the screen. And I do kind of feel that here. And I think one of the things I like about this movie is that this is shot by Adolfo Bartoli, who shot Puppet Master, who shot a bunch of stuff for Full Moon, but also shot Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy. And so it's got a little bit, he always brings a little bit of like Italian eye, I guess you would say, to the movies that he's shooting. And I want to take this opportunity to say, I talked to Steve briefly off mic about this. Tubi has been a wonderful resource finding all this stuff. It has a Full Moon Features channel, tons of resources are there. The Amazon Prime Full Moon channel is great for the same reason. You know, it's kind of one-stop shopping in a way. But I finally took the plunge and just got the Full Moon Features app on my Roku TV.
Yeah.
And I will say, the remastered version of this movie that's on the Full Moon Features app is gorgeous.
Yeah.
It looks incredible. And the two versions that are on Prime Video and Tubi look like utter dog shit.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's a disservice how bad it looks, because I think one of the strengths of this movie is actually looking at how gorgeously some of it was shot. It's really shot well. And there's some interesting camera movement. There's some really nicely composed shots. And I think it when you watch it in this remastered presentation, it looks really good. It's among the short list of best looking Full Moon movies we've watched so far.
I think so. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I will vouch also for that Full Moon app. I will specify that not every movie that we've tried to cover has been available on that Full Moon app for whatever reason. Some of them are just not on the system yet, or so they rotate through like any other movies, because obviously there's complex ownership rights to some of these, and some of them will be on the app, but they'll still have ads as if you were watching them on Tubi. So there are things like that. But some movies, I think most of these like early Full Moon films have been preserved fairly well, you know, as much as they can be for movies that were only ever released on VHS.
Right. I think the majority, or at least a good portion of the Paramount era Full Moon movies, were restored or remastered in some way that make them look probably the best really they've ever looked in these presentations now. There are a
Yeah.
few that haven't been. Like I popped around the app a little bit and threw some of them on to see if there was a big difference between what was there and what was offered on Prime or Tubi. And some of them seem like it's the same transfer that's on there. But this was one where the difference was so incredibly huge. I made the joke on microphone a couple weeks ago in another episode about how the movie we watched was the single most standard definition movie that's ever existed.
Yes, the standardist of definitions.
Yeah, and this, like, I feel like Netherworld on both Tubi and Prime is so SD that it's almost blurry, and the remastered one that's on the app is so pristine and crystal clear. And there's detail in some of the shots, the detail in the carvings on the hand you can see in this one, and you can't really see them because I watched it once really in a shitty transfer and once in a really gorgeous one, and it really is night and day. And so if there's anybody who is listening along or hasn't seen the movie and wants to listen to the episode right before or right after, like, if you're not already subscribed to the Full Moon app but you don't want to pay money for it, like, try to find the remastered one somewhere,
Yeah.
and watch that one. Don't go on a free streaming platform and watch it.
Because I feel like that's sort of the reason to watch this. I think you came down a little more positively on this movie than I
More
did.
than I
but
expected. I'll tell
more
you
than you
that much.
expected, for sure. And I struggle with this movie a little bit because I do think it's incomprehensible. I think the plot is nonsense. It's often silly, but it's not often silly enough. You know, you get flashes early on where it's like, okay, this is going to be nicely batshit this entire time, but it really can't sustain its entire length, and the story just makes no sense whatsoever. But I feel like this movie has great atmosphere. It really does. I think it's got this sort of Southern Gothic look down, and even if it's derivative and silly, like it does give this movie a little bit of juice where I think it's lacking in other places.
Sure.
So I feel like, yeah, it feels like the focus was much more strongly on the mood and the environment and the vibe of it rather than anything having to do with the plot.
It felt like the longest 85-minute movie I've ever seen. Like, it really.
We run
really
into some of
stretches.
those.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I'd like to introduce you to a little movie called Witch House.
Which is, I think, a full 10 minutes shorter than this and feels triple the length. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Witch House is rough. You know,
It should be noted, I think, Steve, I think that this movie, maybe another one of the reasons why you were saying you were reading between the lines, but I'm inclined to agree with you that this sort of caused a rift between Schmoller and Charles Band is because, and now that I've watched it, especially in, like I've just mentioned, in a really pristine presentation, I think this movie was unfairly savaged when it was released, because we've mentioned how at a certain point critics just stopped watching these movies. Like they stopped reviewing them. They didn't care about them. By the mid Paramount era, they really weren't even concerned with like treating them like real movies. And this one, you know, it has like a 12% on Rotten Tomatoes or something, and I'm like, that is absurdly low. Like, there's a lot going on here that maybe it doesn't make a successful whole, but it maybe doesn't equal the sum of its parts, but there are a lot of working parts in this movie that I think work well individually, you know, outside of one another. And just they make a point in Dave J. Williams, Dave J's book and William S. Wilson's book, Came from the Video Aisle, to kind of shit on this movie in a way that they don't do with a lot of the other movies. Like, they basically, in so many words, just say like, this movie sucked. David Schmoller had a huge misstep here. People hated it, and then they kind of just moved on. And I feel like they're with other full moon movies, there's more of sort of a reappraisal or an attempt to mine some complementary stuff out of like a sort of muddled finished product, but they don't really do that with this one. And I'm curious what it is about this one that feels like such a misstep. I mean, maybe it was just that we're looking at it from the scope of like there's 35-ish years of full moon movies, but at the time, like, this came at the same time as like Puppet Master 2 and 3 and Doll Man and Subspecies and Subspecies 2. And those ones, like by and large, are pretty successful. And then I would think even like your Spellcasters and Bad Channels and Demonic Toys was a successful one too, more so than maybe Steve or myself really care, but it is a fan favorite. I think maybe it just has to do with like the fact that Full Moon was firing kind of on all cylinders at this time. So we're looking at it in the context of like, well, there's all these years of like barely watchable Full Moon movies that
Right.
follow.
We're still in 1992. We're in the era where they're flying high. They're still throwing some money at these projects, and there is a sense that somebody behind the camera at some point cares about how this turns out. And I think this does still have that vibe, even if it doesn't all come together.
I might have been affected by because there was that whole era of like the TV Guide review, and where any horror film that was listed, it would get listed in the time, but it would be like a 1 or 2 star, and
every movie was 1 star.
Immediately dismissed. Like Phantasm was Strange Goings On at a Mausoleum, then they move on. That was the blurb. So I might have been affected by that, like just flipping through and seeing a Full Moon title and just thinking, oh well, they didn't like it, so I'm not going to watch it. And that's a whole era of films that I've just never watched because I was affected by them. Probably.
I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because I feel like this is as good a time as any, because like obviously plot wise there's not a ton going on in this movie. I remember reading TV Guide and being kind of flabbergasted by some of the reviews in the TV Guide descriptions, because it would be movies that I liked, and I would see that they were coming on, and they would have a lot of the time, like at max, like 2 stars. If there was a 2.5-star review of a horror or low budget movie in TV Guide, like it had to be that one was really special. And I remember, I think Nightmare on Elm Street 3 had a 1.5-star review or something in the TV Guide. And so do you like that one always jumped out at me, but then there were other ones too that would just have like 0.5 star or no star, or I think maybe it was 1 star was the lowest that they could go in TV Guide. But I would see these 1-star reviews and it kind of made me really self-conscious. Like at the time, I remember thinking like, do I like trash? Am I not of a person of discerning tastes like at the time? Because every Friday the 13th movie was 1 star.
Right. Why not both?
Yes.
You can like trash and be a discerning film.
Right. And now I'm less concerned about that. But like, do you, I'll go to Brian first and then to Steve. Like, do you remember like being at odds with a specific TV Guide review? Like, do you, or it doesn't even have to be TV Guide, but we enjoyed talking so much about TV Guide a week or 2 ago that it just kind of makes me warm and fuzzy to bring it up. Like, is there one that you remember being like, what the fuck are they talking about?
It's a blur at this point, but I mean, I just remember noticing that there was a decided bias against horror films in general, even movies that I liked, and they just couldn't bring themselves to just praise a film for being scary or being good. I mean, films like maybe Halloween or maybe Poltergeist, anything that had like the pedigree behind it or whatever, they would give it a little boost. But anything that we like, I mean, we know trivia on like the sequels of Friday the 13th and things like that. No, they were all just immediately 1 star or 0.5 star or whatever. But back in the day, like back in my day, I'm an old man. When a horror movie came out on a Friday, you just went to go see it. You just went to see it. If it was a sequel, if it was a new movie, you'd go see it and form your own opinions. And that's where a lot of these now classics that have since been remade are all coming from. You just watched whatever you could get your hands on, especially in the VHS era. You just go to the video store, and if they had the best looking artwork, you just pick it off the shelf and form your own opinion. And so a lot of these films have their fans. They're not all perfect, but they have a charm that endures and people enjoy them. This one I probably wouldn't watch again, but I could see I'm pretty more forgiving of films and I can see what they were going for. But yeah, I mean, TV Guide, especially like Siskel and Ebert, I used to always disagree with those guys. I used to, I'd go to bed angry after watching some of their shows.
That was my thing too. Yeah,
I'll revisit their best review. I think is of Halloween. 78. That's my favorite film. That's what got me into horror. So
me too.
I could watch that on YouTube and just feel the warm and fuzzies for that era. But everything else, they were just trash the movies.
Yeah, so. I mean, no, Ebert in particular was a big champion of Halloween. Like, and he did not like horror movies, but he loved that movie.
He was
like,
yeah.
I definitely was over influenced by reviews. It was the TV Guide a little bit, but mostly what I was reading was the Leonard Maltin like movie guide. You know,
Oh
that
yeah,
Right,
big
right.
chunky thing. I would buy a new edition every year, and I would just
me
read it
too.
like a book. Like I would flip around to random pages and then read a review. And now, oh, okay, I know what this movie is for all time. You know, like it's
Mhm.
all kind of locked in. And he was similarly very down on horror movies.
Mhm.
So when I first watched like the first couple of Friday the 13th movies when I was probably like 13 or 14, I didn't like them because I was bringing that baggage of like, oh, okay, well, Malden says this is a bomb and Ebert doesn't like this either. And Ebert does. It wasn't until years later that I really kind of got on board with the Friday the 13th movies because I understood a little bit how to contextualize them in the history of horror. Like, yes, if you're watching those objectively, they're pretty bad movies. Like, let's be
Mhm.
real. Like, they're poorly acted, they're poorly, staged, and it's very gory and prurient. But when you look at them as these kind of elaborate cinematic Rube Goldberg machines, where you're waiting for like this, it's this setup punchline kind of system with those movies, with like set up an elaborate kill and then deliver on that kill. When you look at it more as an amusement park ride rather than like a piece of fine art, you're going to have a lot better time with those movies. And it's just kind of that realization that movies can function on all of those levels, like and as film goers, we can appreciate them on all those levels. I can have a really great time with Puppet Master 3 and then turn around and watch The Babadook and really understand what that movie's going for. Like, it took me a while to sort of form my own opinions and kind of break away from the critic
Well, that
ideas. But
the Leonard Maltin guide, that was my Bible for a while
yeah,
too. And I got
Same,
one
yeah.
every year, every new edition for Christmas in my
Yep.
stocking. And,
Yep.
which
and it
was
looked
me too, which made it a very obvious stocking gift,
the
right?
most
Like
obvious stocking stuffer of all
you know
time. It
it's
was
in
just
there.
this brick that was weighing your stocking down. The thumbtack holding it up was hanging on for dear life, but it was there. But that bomb, that was a scarlet letter
Oh
because
yeah.
I would read synopses of movies that Leonard Maltin gave a bomb review to. And there were things I remember. I mean, my memory is a little fuzzy, so I could be getting this wrong, but I feel like Maniac was one where I just
Yeah.
had this preconceived notion at age 13 or something that Maniac was this terrible, unredeeming movie. And I think I carried that without ever having actually seen it for a few more years after that. And then it's
Mhm.
like, then you kind of go through the things where it's like, oh no, like now I understand the importance of Maniac. Oh, now I'm diving a little deeper into the relationship between Bill Lustig and Larry Cohen. And now I'm seeing other movies that they collaborated on, and I'm understanding like their importance within the genre. And it's like silly how a lot of these people were discredited when really they were incredibly important pioneers in a lot of ways. And that was the problem, like you said, Steve, with that rating in the Leonard Maltin guide. I mean, you would read the 3.5 star reviews and the 4 star reviews, and it would be all of the usual suspects that you would expect, your
Mhm.
Godfathers and your Casablancas and stuff like that. But then I was always a little bit more interested in the grimy stuff that was getting the low reviews. And I always was a little curious, like, well, what is it about this movie? The movies that I remember loving when I was about 10 years old that I remember just being completely savaged, like probably rightfully in that book though, were the Ernest movies and the Police Academy movies. And
Yeah,
I
those ones were
remember
really ripped
watching Police
apart.
Academy sequels and recognizing like, oh no, these deserve that 1.5 star rating. Like Assignment Miami Beach deserves 1.5 star. It shouldn't even have that much without Steve Gutenberg in it.
Although Ernest
Exactly.
Saves Christmas is a classic.
I still have not seen that one. I'm going to watch that this month
That's
for the
probably
holidays.
his all around better. I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't seen the others. I've seen clips of them, but maybe I should check them out. But Ernest Saves Christmas, that one is a really good holiday comedy.
Ernest Goes to
I
Camp for me was a movie that was really formative. I
yeah.
saw it at probably age 7 or 8, whenever it was kind of first released on video. I remember I had a next door neighbor a couple of years older than me who was like, "You have to go rent this movie. It's so funny, blah, blah, blah." And because I was a really impressionable kid, I was like, they told me it's funny, therefore it's funny. And so I went and I rented it. But I also remember like responding emotionally to it and like
Oh yeah, there's a sad bit. He's got a little
Oh,
song in there.
don't even
Yeah.
start, Steve. I'm gonna get choked up if he's. I'm gonna
I
I'm gonna
I
start looking
sure
at a
am glad it's
turtle and
raining.
crying.
I'm so glad it's raining right now.
Oh my God, stop it! You're a monster. But like, I remember we taped it from VHS. I had a taped copy of it, and I watched it over and over and over again. And Saves Christmas, I watched a ton, and Goes to Jail, I watched a ton, which I think is a pretty fun movie also. And then Scared Stupid is the one that I see people just a few years younger than me have super strong nostalgia for. It was just a little too late for me. I was already off that train at that time. I think I did see it, maybe even in the theater, but did not connect well, like I did really with the first three. And then I remember just like, oh, I have this videotape that's got Police Academy 4, Citizens on Patrol on it. I'm like, this is the best movie ever. And then I read Leonard Maltin. I went, I was wrong.
You were
I
wrong.
think I saw that one in the theater and declared that same thing.
The the
think
big reviews I remember, and then I'll move off this topic. I do remember that Malden gave 2-star reviews to both The Shining and Evil Dead 2, but he changed the one on the Evil Dead 2. He left The Shining as a 2-star, but there was an edition where Evil Dead 2 was bumped up a full star. Shining was not. Worth mentioning. But I think the fact that we have digressed into the Leonard Maltin guide and Ernest movies means that we have reached the end of our discussion on Netherworld.
Maybe
I
not
loved
for the
it,
listeners, but
to be
for us
clear.
at least. And that's really all that matters.
I loved it. But so we just want to thank Brian again for being here. Thank you so much for taking the time and diving in and watching this weird movie with us. So we really appreciate having you. Where can people find you and all of your amazing work that you're doing?
I have my own website, briansmithhorror.com, that has my Twitter, or X or whatever it's called nowadays. My
Musk's
Instagram.
Folly. Yeah.
I'm on Instagram a lot. And you can follow New York City Horror Film Festival. It's coming up December 10th. It's December 7th through the 10th in New York. If you're not in New York, if you want to do the virtual festival, it's going to be December 8th through the 12th on Eventive. And that's nychorrorfest.com.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Amazing. And Jared, where can people find us?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, Steve. So if you want to follow the show on Instagram, you can find the show's official Instagram at puppetmasters_Castle Freaks. You can also find me at _Giallo_Jerry or Steve at Minotaur Matador. Like Brian, we are also on X and Blue Sky and Threads. So if you want to jump on there, all you have to do is search for the show name and you will find our profile. One thing that I would love to ask of people, we have gotten some amazing feedback from people. We've got a nice number of people tuning in every week. Steve and I are super thrilled about how much traction the show's been gaining. But if you are so inclined, jump onto Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you are listening and drop us a 5-star rating. And also, if you can find the time, a short review. The more of them that there are, the bigger the audience the show will reach. And so we would greatly appreciate anyone who's enjoying the show. Throw us some kind words on any of those platforms, and you would be doing us a huge service. But we are not the only show that Steve is a part of. So Steve, tell us a little bit about another endeavor that you've got going on.
Well, absolutely. I'm also the host of the show Cinema Arcade. That's all one word, cinema and arcade mashed together. That's exactly what we do on that show. We are watching a movie and then playing the video game adaptation of it. So we can see how these different pieces of art coincide or diverge in various different ways. We are when this comes out, we will have just recently wrapped up our mini series into the Alien franchise. We did the whole Alien quadrilogy because there aren't any games based on Prometheus or Covenant. But we did the quadrilogy. A lot of fun to talk about. And now we are in December, which means we are doing an entire month of holiday themed movies and games. So I'm talking Home Alone. I'm talking Polar Express. I'm talking Die Hard. Yes, that's right. I'm saying it. It's a Christmas movie. And we're talking Elf. Obviously, lots of big ones to go into. And we have a very big one to go into next week here on the show.
Boy, do we ever.
If I am remembering the proper order that we have agreed upon for these episodes, our next episode is going to be Bloodstone Subspecies 2, a huge sequel to one of the preeminent, probably the most prestigious series in the Full Moon franchise.
I would agree.
This would also be a good time to tell you guys that we have a bonus episode for you coming this week, just after. It's going to be our little Christmas gift to you all. We have an exclusive interview with the stars of Subspecies 2, the amazing Denise Duff and Kevin Spiritus, who both showed up together to talk about the movie and their careers with us. We had such an amazing time talking to them. They
Outstanding
are
conversation.
wild, fantastic people. So definitely check that out. It's going to be a great time to listen to, and to check out our episode on Subspecies coming up next week.
Very cool.
Thank you, listeners, and thank you, Brian, again for taking the time to join us. And we will see you next week for what may or may not be my favorite Full Moon movie. We'll find out.
Spoilers.
Yeah, we'll see you next week for Subspecies 2. Stay tuned.
I say. I do
Thank you.
declare.